Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Rogue Health Economist livecast. Every day we are looking at health through the lens of economics, and this week we are talking about immunity, the immune system. It couldn't be a more timely topic given what's happening in the world. Yesterday we heard all about reversing autoimmune conditions with functional medicine, functional nutrition, and so leading into that, straight after that, we have the godfather of functional medicine. He's a nutritional biochemist and a good friend of mine, and I'm super happy to have you here to talk all things health economics and all things immune system. Welcome, Dr. Jeffrey Bland.
Well, James, thanks. What a treat. And yes, this is the day of the, or the age of the immune system, isn't it? No question.
Absolutely. So, there's been countless, I guess I want to start with the Medium article that you wrote last week that I thought was very, very interesting, in sort of like this shift in the way that we're thinking and what permanent shifts will be caused as a result of this COVID issue. And maybe we could just start there for people who didn't read it, just, some of your thinking as towards, what has shifted and what has shifted specifically with regard to our understanding of immunity.
Yeah, I think that there are three major shifting sands right now that are very important. In my article, I wrote of five, but I want to emphasize three because I think that they are really germane to the situation that we find ourselves in and how we hopefully will not only get out of this situation, but will also prevent getting back into the situation in the future. And those three are, I'll just quickly state them and then I'll give a little more granularity. Number one is the changing in how we see public health, moving from a community-based, population-based perspective to an individual precision-based perspective. So that's number one. Number two is, I think, the redefining of what is prevention. And we have historically thought of prevention as a way of approaching what are called risk factors, where a person has a blood test or some evaluation done and something pops out that relates to a risk to a major disease, like elevated cholesterol and the risk to heart disease would be a good example. And then you intervene with a drug, generally, to treat that risk factor. And that's the way we've considered prevention, along with, public health concepts of immunization, pap smears, and all that kind of stuff. And then the third change that's going to occur as we move to a prevention that's personally focused and what I would call more defined of the individual need and rather than risk categories. The third is how we will then redefine the economics of healthcare to actually deliver this kind of personalized lifestyle engaged care that is built around precision public health and not just on community population-based information. Because I think we started to recognize, and COVID certainly has brought it to our attention, that the general principles of health are useful, but they don't really speak to the individual person as to how they got sick and what they need to do to prevent it or to manage it. That becomes a different question, which we have now need different answers for, but fortunately we have those tools. We just need to find ways of introducing within our system, reinforcing their delivery, and finding ways to reimburse for services.
Well, that gets right into the heart of the Rogue Health Economist podcast, Jeff, because I'm super interested in that, transition to, to payments and what we can do. I've heard you talk for a while about this idea of precision public health, and I've got, very interested in it myself. And I couldn't help but think that the range of experiences that a range of people in the population have with what's essentially the same virus, obviously sort of unmasks that reality.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the nail on the head. We've often thought that a infectious disease is caused by a single organism, in this case, a virus, this specific variant of a COVID virus, and that coronavirus, and that this virus then causes an infection that results in a person having a specific type of set of symptoms and the trajectory in the disease. It's going to be the same because the virus is the same, so the person must have the same disease. You call it the same thing, so it must look the same. And now what we recognize is that the disease is not the virus. Let me say it again. The disease is not the virus. The disease is the interaction of the virus with an individual and their own unique immune system, which produces then their own unique set of outcomes based upon that relationship. And you can't change the virus because it is already locked into its structure. What you can change is the receptivity of the individual to the virus and how it creates that implication of the virus-human interaction that we call the disease. That's the modifiable factor. And what we've recognized is that the biggest factor that relate to that connection between the virus and the person is their lifestyle and the environment and the things that they do to influence their immunological resistance. And each person carries with them in their own reserves, their own biological and health reserves, certain aspects of resistance, resilience, or affinity toward, susceptibility toward the infection. That's where we should be spending our time understanding and personalizing.
Beautiful. Well, I'd love to get into some of that because, already on this podcast, in one of the first episode, I showed Dr. Vojdani's slide from our webinar, which showed, the 6 factors that determines where people end on that map. And on Friday, we had Dr. Zach Bush in, and he was talking specifically about the toxic elements and toxicity as a sort of a key driver of function. And that was the first line in Dr. Vojdani's piece with the sort of the way that he describes, your total exposure in life to what you've come across. And so can we first, before we talk into some of those other lifestyle pieces, can we talk about toxicity as a primary driver of denting immune resilience?
Yes. So if you look at our body from a kind of a standing away from it and kind of examine what it does, it interfaces with the outside and inside world through 3 basic systems. And it's those systems that really communicate what's going on outside the body to the functions and things going on inside the body. And what are those 3 things? Number 1 is the nervous system, which we recognize is sampling all the time, the outside and inside world, through proprioception, sight, sound, taste, smell, feel, all these various things that are going on with regard to the nervous system. Secondly is the immune system, because the immune system is directly interfacing with the outside and inside world. And the third, which people often forget about, is the microbiome, which is sampling the outside and inside world, this very complex network of biological organisms that live in our gut. And those biological organisms living in our gut are connected directly to both our immune system and our nervous system. So you might think of that as kind of a super system. It's all interacting. The nervous system, the immune system, and the microbiome share the responsibility for communicating with the outside and inside world and translating that into messages that inform the body how it should respond. Should it respond as all is peaceful and happy and kumbaya and graceful and loving, and therefore we're all just like in happy, sympathetic, go forward harmony? Or should it see the outside and inside world as a hostile, dangerous place with foreigners that are barring at the gate and trying to do damage, and so activating the process of alarm, which we call defense, which is, by the way, the god of war, Mars, the color red, inflammation, rubor, color, and dolor, swelling, redness, and pain. So when you start looking at those 3 systems, the immune system, the nervous system, and the microbiome, what are things that really influence their personality, influence how they're going to respond, either as kumbaya, all is peaceful, or no, alarm, something is amiss and we need to sit up and do battle. And of those, the family of things that can create that outcome is toxic chemicals, so-called xenobiotics. And xenobiotics are a very unique kind of complex term. That's an X word. You can hold it for Scrabble and you can beat your partner if you get the right letters. But xenobiotics is a term that refers to foreign biological materials. things that are not native to the human body. Now, we've always been exposed as a human being to xenobiotics, to things that are foreign to the human being. It could be mold metabolites, it could be various kinds of things from volcanic eruptions, toxic gases. So we've all had exposures. But over the last, as you know, better part of 50 to 60 years now, we have brought into our environment literally tens of thousands of new human-made chemicals that the body has to come to grips with. And that system that is responding to those foreigners, as you were talking about, as so-called toxins, are things that are influencing what is called our exposome. And our exposome is made up of the nervous system, the immune system, and our microbiome. So that's a term that's been applied to kind of how those things interact one with the other. Now, what does that really mean? What it really means is that when we used to define toxicology, if you were a toxicologist, it was how poisons worked and how they would cause you to be sick and die. And through the field of toxicology was developed the concept of a lethal dose, LD, and how much would be required to kill in a control experiment 50% of the animals. We call that an LD50. So 50% of the animals would be killed with a specific exposure to a specific dose of something like cyanide. That would be a good example. But what happens when you start going to the exposure to chronically toxic substances that are not so toxic that they produce immediate death? They just cause disabling of the exposome and cause alteration in the function of the immune, nervous, and microbiome systems. In those cases, now we have something different. We have chronic toxicity. And chronic toxicity was not a field that really was developed when toxicology was early developed. Toxicology was to look at poisons. Now we're talking about chronic modulators of the exposome, which demonstrate their effects in people how? Through the nervous system, the immune system, and the microbiome. So now we have new disciplines called immunotoxicology and neurotoxicology, which are related to the effects that low level of these toxic substances have on chronic influence on our function that are much more subtle and difficult to understand. They may create immune dysfunction that we call autoimmune disease, which is really not autoimmune disease at all. It's a whole mislabeled thing. Autoimmune disease, the term auto suggests that we are doing something against ourselves. We're producing something to damage our own host tissues by direct implication. And that's not what is occurring. Our body is actually producing defensive substances against a foreigner that has been caused by the exposure to foreign chemicals. We now become foreign in our own body. So our immune system is actually doing what it should do. It's responding to foreigners. Now you say, well, why do some people get autoimmune disease and others do not? We talk about autoimmune disease being bad if a person has a defective immune system. No, it's not a defective system. It actually may be a hyper-functioning immune system that is the most sensitive to foreigners on board. So it's not like it's a danger. It's actually a warning sign that something that person is exposed to is actually inducing in their body a foreigner experience that their body is perceiving as dangerous. So when you start asking then, what's the effect of over 50,000 new human-made chemicals that are now impacting on our exposome on a daily basis, depending on where we live and how we eat and where we hang out? How do those 50,000 chemicals influence the nervous and immune system and the microbiome? And the answer to that question is no one fully knows, because this is a new area of investigation. But what we do know without any question is that the combination of all these chemicals on the complex immune, nervous, and microbiome systems of humans produces a whole new range of chronic health problems that we never experienced before, that are a consequence of what people call environmental toxicity. I would call it environmental sensitivity, that we are actually generating an immune response, a nervous system response that is ranging across symptoms as far ranging as cognitive dysfunction and memory loss, to low energy, to sleep disturbances, to skin problems, to behavior difficulties, to sore joints, to gut problems, to cardiovascular difficulties, to liver problems. I mean, you can just go down the list. It's a lexicon of problems.
Absolutely. So I'd love to just dive into one specific xenobiotic because I just want to take people through a journey. So let's talk about pharmaceutical drugs, right? And I want to talk about one of the concepts that I laid down in the first episode was this idea of diminishing marginal returns, right? So in the early days, like if you're looking at the data, you see, okay, drugs, high upside, get rid of the symptoms, low downside, you know, in a few days you don't see. Then you start to see that famous, thing that you introduced me to, which is the Nature article showing when you actually look at the number needed to treat, not really that effective, and maybe there's some problems with long-term taking of the drugs. Now, I'd just love to get your thoughts on like these drugs that are like turning off pathways in the body. It seems like, from my perspective, is that it's likely that these are having like the overuse of those medications, is leading to partly why America's response to the virus is worse than other countries, because we just have a much greater use of that specific xenobiotic throughout society than any other country.
Well, I think you're raising an extraordinarily important topic. Let me just, before I kind of respond, let me give a factoid. In the United States today, there are approximately, depending on what statistics you want to use, anywhere between 10 and 20 million people, probably that's a conservative estimate, who are on what we call immunosuppressive drugs. And by the name immunosuppressive, it means that it's having an effect on the immune system by suppressing its activity. And as a consequence, if you look at the labeling on some of these drugs, what are called black box labeling, the labeling on the drug will say this drug may reduce your immune system efficiency such that you now have a risk of opportunistic infection, like tuberculosis, that was laying dormant because your immune system kept it quiet, but now that we're suppressing your immune system with this drug, now it can gain a new foothold. Or Epstein-Barr virus would be another example of something that was maybe held in check, or herpes that are held in check with an immune system that's functional, but when you suppress it, now it has a chance to kind of be reignited. The concept of immunosuppressive drugs is kind of part of this xenobiotic, because these are foreign molecules, or molecules that are unique to the individual, that are creating this suppression of their immune system function. It may also be antibodies to their own immune system activity, like the anti-TNF antibodies, but they all then limit the body's normal regulatory process to how it responds to the outside and inside world. Now, with that in mind, let's go to your model. What happens if you take a drug that was designed to be effective for the short term to manage a crisis health problem, if you start extending the use of that drug in chronic problems that go on for months, years, and maybe decades? Remembering that virtually every drug that's approved has had a limited study in duration of its application to the patient that are being treated. So a long-term study might be 6 months, maybe in some exceptional examples, a year. But in most cases, the intervention trials that are used to approve pharmaceutical drugs are of shorter duration, in the order of many months. Therefore, when we see that they have a positive benefit and that their risk to adverse effects are low, it gives us confidence that those drugs must be approved and supported by our Food and Drug Administration as safe and effective. But what's the difficulty then when we take that drug that was approved for a short-term use and we start extending it out, now just beyond months, but years and even decades of application? This is an experiment that really we don't have any data on, except the people that are taking it. And we've got some interesting information about what happens when those things occur. Let me give you the classic example that everyone would cite in pharmacology as to the difference between short-term administration of a drug and long-term of that same drug. And this was the most significant singular discovery made in American pharmacology, actually global pharmacology, that occurred in the 1930s and 40s. It came after the discovery of antibiotics, and it was the discovery of cortisone and cortisol. And you might recall when the first pharmaceutical drugs that were produced that were derivatives of the body's natural cortisol, which has an immune suppressing effect, was made available for medicine to prescribe, it was like unheard of revolution. People that were sick and feeling horrible and low energy and chronic pain, when they took these cortisone derivatives, had just like were being reborn. And the testimonials that you can go back and read were so remarkable that it was felt early on that this was a wonder drug class of drugs that people could remediate all sorts of problems with by taking these drugs indefinitely. And the enthusiasm around these drugs was unbounded.
What year was that? What year was peak enthusiasm?
So this would be like the 50s and coming into the early 60s.
Okay.
And then we found that as people were sustained on these drugs for a period of time, not just in the short-term treatment of acute inflammation, but long-term, that all sorts of things started to happen. Their skin started to thin and they started bruising and having skin lesions. Their bones started to thin. It adversely affected their cardiovascular system. It made them more susceptible to infection. So suddenly people said, well, hold up, these wonder drugs that were so great for short-term application, when we extend this, the wonder doesn't discontinue on. It bends the curve, and now these drugs actually start killing the person.
Sounds like a diminishing marginal return to me.
That's the example I'm using.
Exactly.
So you won't find now any responsible physician using long-term corticosteroid drugs for the management of a patient unless there's really an extreme reason for doing that, and they follow the patients very, very carefully, because the adverse effects over long terms are very, very serious. So we could take that example of the corticosteroid drugs and apply it to many other drug families and start to see what happens over longer term administration in terms of bending the curve from good into not so good.
So just briefly on two other drugs, just to talk about the pathways, ACE inhibitors and statins seem to be a significant problem for COVID.
Well, I'm actually a contrarian with the ACE inhibitors. I think the ACE inhibitors will prove to be beneficial. And I think that there's now an emerging body of literature to say that the ARBs, the angiotensin converting enzyme receptor blockers, as contrasted to the direct inhibitors, are actually going to be proving beneficial to prevent COVID infectivity. There's now some very nice studies that have come out of both Wuhan and out of Harvard, Mass General, and out of England, that all show that the individuals on these medications probably have at least no adverse effects and probably have some beneficial effects. So I think, again, this is short term because we're not talking about people having infection with COVID for hopefully an infinite length of time.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, so before we get into like the new thesis of immune rejuvenation, I'd love to see, like, we mentioned toxicity as one area. There are these 5 other sort of fundamentals of health creation: diet, exercise, community, sleep, and stress. And I've seen over the years, I've been sitting in the back of lectures and seen data that shows how each of those have a direct effect on immunity. So could you just take us through each of those briefly and just sort of talk about the mechanism by which, let's say, food and immune health is connected?
Yeah, that's great. So we can start with food, because that's probably the one that people are most familiar with. We know that there are a whole series of nutrients that are found within complex diets that interface with the regulation of our immune system. And, our immune system is very fascinating. Its origin is entirely coming out of our bone marrow. Probably people understand that the so-called hematopoietic stem cells that are in our bone marrow are the origin of all of our both red and white blood cells that are our immune system cells. And when they come out of the bone marrow, they have to be formed correctly with the right kind of integrity. And those bone marrow cells are really dependent upon nutritional status, particularly things like B12, folic acid. There's a lot of cellular turnover, so the nutrients that are required to make new cells are really then going to be very, very important for the regulation of immune cell formation. And just to give you an idea, every 10 seconds, our bone marrow makes about 1 million white blood cells, about 20 million red cells, and about 30 million platelets. So it's really actively making new cells all the time, and that is dependent upon specific nutrients that are involved with DNA replication and with cellular regeneration. So that's maybe an obvious example. But then beyond that, beyond the B vitamins, then we get into what about protein? Because we recognize that certain amino acids are very important for immune cell function, arginine being a good example, glutamine being a good example. Then we talk about, well, what about other fat-soluble vitamins? Well, we know that vitamin A, retinoic acid, coming out of retinol, is a very, very important part of the immune system development. We also know that vitamin D, which has gotten a tremendous amount of attention, is extraordinarily important for regulation of the personality of our immune system, the so-called innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. So I could go down the lexicon of each of the nutrients, but let's just suffice to say, they all have very important roles to play in stabilizing immune system function. So nutrient deprivation or chronic nutrient undernutrition can play a very adverse effect on immune function. Let's move that then into exercise. And exercise is a very, very interesting example, because you would say, well, hold it, now how can exercise influence the formation of our blood cells that make up our immune system? I mean, exercise is a physical activity. How can it be translated into the organic nature of a cell? And it turns out that this is exciting new work that is just really coming about in the last couple of years, to recognize that there are receptors on the surface of cells that actually pick up the effects that the exercise has on our metabolism. As you know, aerobic exercise has a different effect on our metabolism than anaerobic exercise. Anaerobic exercise kind of builds up a different set of metabolites, like lactic acid, for instance, that influences how cells work differently than aerobic exercise, where you have more oxygen flowing and you have more metabolism of glucose as an energy fuel, and you have different mitochondrial bioenergetics. So exercise sends signals, depending upon the type of exercise, to the body's energetic systems, which are absolutely important in regulating the immune system. Because think about it, our immune system is powered up by energy that's generated by how food is metabolized. And it is one of the more active cell types in all of our body. It's turning over so rapidly, it's eating up energy. And that's why if you eat a really high sugar diet, it can actually have an adverse effect on your immune system, because it's actually blunting some of the balance that's required for proper nutrition to support the immune system. So we want to stay away from high sugar when we have an infection and we have an immune insult. We want to have balanced, kind of time-release glucose that comes as minimally refined complex carbohydrate, proper levels of essential fatty acids, particularly omega-3s, that are found to be very important for immune activity, and protein, particularly a balance of the branched chain amino acids. So all of these particular things then relate to how exercise then connects itself to immune function. Then we go to stress. Well, I mean, it's fairly obvious. I've already talked about the cortisol relationship. Where does cortisol come from? It comes from the adrenal glands, the stress glands sitting on our kidneys. And stress modulates the so-called adrenal cortical system, the sympathetic nervous system. Those compounds that are produced by activation of the stress response, cortisol, DHEA and its metabolites, aldosterone and other members of this family, are agents that are known to, again, interact with the immune system, causing immunosuppression. Just as if I took a cortisone drug, over time it would cause immunosuppression. If our addicted to our stress occurs, we have high levels of cortisol, that can affect our immune system as well. So stress management gives you balance of the hormones that regulate your immune system function, including, by the way, the sex steroid hormones as well. This is one of the reasons that women seem to have less exposure or less maybe infection with COVID-19, in that their hormone estrogen or estradiol is an immunoactive hormone that helps to regulate their immune system. Then we go from there to sleep. Well, now we recognize sleep is tightly tied to the circadian rhythms, things that we've learned from Sachinanda Panda at SOC and Matt Walker at the University of Cal Berkeley. So these biological rhythms, these circadian rhythms, are tied together with our clock, our circadian clock that is in the brain, in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of our brain, that regulates the clocks in every cell of our body. And why is this important? Because the temporal control of that clock in our brain goes through a gland called the pineal gland. The pineal gland secretes a unique hormone that is called melatonin. And melatonin, when it's secreted into our blood, travels in our blood system to another gland called the thymus gland up here below the thyroid in our base of our neck. And the thymus gland is what regulates how our immune system is functioning. The so-called T cells of our immune system stand for thymus-dependent lymphocytes, which are part of our regulatory system. So we then see sleep can pattern and program the production of melatonin, which in turn programs the thymus gland's control over immunity. So all these things work together as a network to regulate our immune vigilance.
Right. Well, I want to take the last one because this is my jam and I just wrote the book on it. And the moment that I knew that this was the biggest thing, I know that you were in the room too, because it was the 2015, I think, IFM conference, and it was George Slavich, Human Social Genomics. And he was like, hey, look, it's the biggest, social isolation is the biggest driver of all-cause mortality, and it has specific effect on the immune pathways, and ultimately, like, it's immunity that goes down first from isolation. And I know that you were sitting in the back. I was sitting next to Dr. Shilpa Saxena that day, and we looked at each other and were like, oh my God, this is like, you know, justifying and sort of bringing into context, not just the need for this sort of group visit structure, you know, creating community, but also that communities of people execute these other four things, you know, together. And ultimately that was sort of what led to eventually the book. And I'd love for you just to talk into that, because I just feel like here we are all at home, you know, a little bit less connected than maybe we used to be, and what kind of effect that has.
Yeah, I think, James, you're to be complimented. I think the way that you've constructed this in an understandable and user-friendly way is really admirable, because these are fairly sophisticated topics when you get down into the weeds with regard to all the connections to our physiology and how it operates mechanistically. And I think you've done a really good job of kind of making it approachable and utilizable and accessible. The recognition, I think, comes back to the age-old, I guess, truth that humans are basically social animals. We hang out in packs, we hang out in tribes, we hang out in social structures. We're not free-ranging organisms. There are exceptions to this. We can think of people that have lived in the woods by themselves for their life, but in general, most human beings are very social, and they gain strength through community. They gain strength emotionally, physiologically, physically, and probably spiritually as well. And that crosses over into a whole nother question. But we recognize that all of these things that are the connections that really make us human are the diverse structures that give us resilience, give us a sense of purpose, give us meaning. And meaning translates into locus of control. Locus of control translates into self-efficacy. Self-efficacy translates into emotional, physical, and spiritual health. So all of those things are intertwined, and they tie back into social structures, why people have aggregated the way they have over the dawn of human evolution.
Self-efficacy across a population leads to a decrease in costs in healthcare that has been completely unattainable in an individualized market. And that's why, that's the whole point of the podcast. So I really appreciate you saying that. Okay, so now I want to move on to the sort of topic that I know that we've been kind of waiting to talk about a little bit, which is everyone and his brother has got an immune boosting plan, right? During COVID, right? Immune boosting is now gone from being like a thing that was talked about in a, you know, sort of like the health community, to now everyone looking to boost this or boost that. And I know you have a very specific thought about what boosting should be and maybe what it shouldn't be, and what that means. And maybe it's time for a new understanding of what we should be doing for the immune system. I'd love for you to share that.
Yeah, I think the term immune boosting, which has been with us now for many decades as an aspirational desire to boost the immune system, is now undergoing reevaluation as a term. And the reason for that is that, let's just, for the sake of discussion for a moment, say that our immune system somehow was collecting injuries, and it was immune system was somewhat damaged. And so what would happen if that immune system, when it was damaged, spoke back to us by saying, I'm not fully healthy, and the way I'm going to tell you about that is that I'm going to speak back by producing messengers of inflammation. So when I'm unhealthy, I'm going to tell you I'm angry a little bit, and I'm going to be inflamed. So now we say we're going to boost the immune system, which means we're going to make those voices even more strong because they're there to tell you their status. So we now support the immune system with boosters. Well, that can actually not only not do any good, it could do worse. It could aggravate that person's immune imbalance. It could create a louder voice. And in fact, I've just spoken theoretically, but actually in actual fact, that's what can happen. If you give immune boosters to a person who is in a chronic inflamed state, you can aggravate and accentuate that situation of inflammation. And so the question is really not about boosting. And in fact, Tony Fauci was recently asked what he thought about immune boosting. And he said, just as really even more eloquently than I've said it just a moment ago, he said the concept of immune boosting has never been proven to be useful. And until it is, we can assume that at worst it may do nothing, but at least it may do nothing. And at worst, it may be dangerous. And so if you don't want to boost the immune system, what do you want to do? You want to modulate your immune system so it can find its proper balance. And to modulate the immune system means you want to get rid of the damaged cells, the ones that are carrying bad memories, the ones that are trying to speak back to you and tell you they're inflamed and they're going to let you know about it. Now, how do you do that? Well, you do that because the body is constantly regenerating itself. It's constantly getting rid of bad cells and replacing them, hopefully, with good cells. But what happens if the rate of replacing of good cells is exceeded by the maintenance of old cells that are damaged? Now you're in a state of immune alarm and immune antagonism. Therefore, the future of what we see happening in immunological research now is not immune boosting, it's immune rejuvenation. It's helping the old cells to be eliminated as garbage and recycled, and have the new cells coming out of the hematopoietic stem cells having the vitality of young, uninitiated, naive cells that are able to do what you used to do when you were young, and that is have a lot more resilience to your environment. And so the construct that we're witnessing now is, how do you not just boost the immune system, but how do you rejuvenate the immune system to produce a younger acting immune system, not one that's suffering from what is called immunosenescence, meaning aged immune system, which is by nature suffering the pale of inflammation.
Yeah, so my pediatrician, Dr. Larry Palevsky, who used to treat my daughter, he was like, look, it's not about boosting the immune system. It's about getting rid of the things that are causing the immune system to be suboptimal. And I think, that was what, 7 years ago. And I just remember being hit with that. And I'm super excited you shared that. So tell me, how do you do it? How do you do it? What are the ways that you can do that? What are all the different ways available to us to rejuvenate our immune systems and, I guess, make us all a little bit harder to kill?
Yeah, I think that the answer to that question in a simple way, I mean, I could get lost in the weeds here, so I'll be cautious not to go there. But I think the simple answer is, if we go back and we evaluate, as Dan Buettner has done, traditional cultures that have been living in fairly untechnologically sophisticated environments and cultures, and who do not, in the absence of modern medicine, get a lot of infections and don't have a lot of inflammation and don't get arthritis when they're 30 and seem to be vital into their later age years if they can uh, prevent being injured and causing a lethal outcome. Those blue zones, as he calls them, are cultures that are historically related to people who are doing certain things that are rejuvenating their immune system. And that's where the real learning is now going on with immunologists that are studying these cultures, saying, well, why is it when these people that were in Vilcabamba, or they were in the Himalayas, or they were in Costa Rica, why is it when they moved from their traditional, what we consider kind of primitive lifestyles, and those same genes then got moved into the westernized, technologically sophisticated lifestyle, they suddenly get these diseases that their neighbors get that they didn't have at all when they were living in their native environment. And we say, oh, well, gee whiz, not everybody's going to go back and live in the bush or live in the jungle or live in a primitive. So, I mean, that doesn't sound very practical. But yet there is another blue zone, which I know you've spoken to and sounds very antithetical to that concept. And that is a blue zone that sits right in the middle of Los Angeles County. And this is Loma Linda, California.
Yeah.
And Loma Linda, California breathes the same air as other Los Angeles Angelinos, drinks the same water, goes on the same freeways. But these people then do not have nearly the kind of immunologically related disorders as people living outside of Loma Linda, California. So they're a blue zone within a non-blue zone environment. Now, what are they doing? Well, they're eating much more vegetable-based diets. They're not using a lot of alcohol and drugs. They're staying away from smoking. They have active lifestyles. They have a lot of spiritual development and community. They are doing all the things that Buettner has found are associated with the blue zone long-lived individuals. And when we study their immune systems, which we now have the ability to do using sophisticated what's called immunophenotyping, we're able to see that their immune systems have greater activity and greater vigilance and greater ability to regulate infections and regulate agents that could cause injury. So that's where we would start, I believe, is to look at people by their own experience in life over centuries of culture are already achieving immunosenescence naturally because they've learned how to do it and they stay with it.
Amazing. I guess I've been looking for a while to think about, is there one common entry point where if people were able to view health through that entry point, it would inspire them to want to take care of their type 2 diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disease, mental health, like all these different issues that come up that look kind of separate, but maybe they're all connected. And what I've come to the conclusion of, from COVID and actually being in this world and seeing it, is that actually the immune system is the thing that connects all of these things. Because ultimately, how do you reduce your risk of dying from COVID? Well, not having type 2 diabetes or a metabolic dysfunction is a big part of that. But and I just feel like it's kind of like the moment for maybe kind of the three things that you talked about there: the immune system, the microbiome, and the nervous system. If you proactively take care of those three things, the tree of disease that is coming from those things kind of you're creating health in that way. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that, because it seems to me that if we could have groups of people focus on rejuvenating their immune systems, the impact on all these disease categories would be transformational.
Well, I think you just said everything that's on my life process for the remainder of my years as a professional. At 74 years, that's what I've learned. Exactly what you just said. That if we really want to examine how to motivate people to make changes that will map out against every chronic disease, and not without exception, every chronic disease, it's to understand how to rejuvenate people's immune system because of the reasons you just cited. And we could go into long mechanistic explanation as to how the immune system is connected to everything from heart disease to cancer to diabetes to dementia to, you name it, arthritis, obviously. But all of those have an immune system connection. And that's why once you get into the door of immune system, you're also into the door of the nervous system. And you're also into the room that the door of the microbiome. Now you're asking a systems biology approach rather than trying to treat the effect, you're upstream actually dealing with the cause. And it is my belief that we are witnessing the emergence out of this COVID-19 of a new medicine. Now, it's not going to change overnight, but we have put a vector into the system, as you already indicated, that is irreversible, that intelligent, thoughtful, sentient human beings, they don't have to be medical doctors or researchers to understand this, will understand that the reason that some people who get COVID infection get cardiovascular symptoms and die of vasculars, others die of pulmonary disease, others die of hematological diseases like blood clotting disorders. The reason that you see these varied forms of outcome is it is in a reflection of the different immune potentials that different individuals have, which we call comorbidities, but they're actually not comorbidities. They are central alterations in their immune system resilience. And we are now starting to learn for the first time how to measure immune system resilience prior to the onset of an infection. Wouldn't it be unique to go to your healthcare provider and they don't just measure your disease risk by looking at blood cholesterol, they actually measure your health reserve by measuring your immune function. And that's where we're going. That's the next step in developing a healthcare system, not just a disease care system.
I love that. I love everything about it, and I'm super excited to, I'm super excited to be just involved in functional medicine, because I see that it is a common language for providers to rally around that has those fundamentals of health creation that helps the body helps you understand how the body breaks down over time. And some of the measures for health measuring are here, and some more of those measures are coming. And as they come online, it's just to become more and more obvious that this is the way to go. So I know that you've been involved in some innovations in maybe speeding up the process of immune rejuvenation. And, we've had conversations over 2 years about your desire to see this health system emerge, and I'm committed to it. And I hopefully have a few more years than you. So know that I'm all in on this for my life too, because I think through the lens of The Economist, I'm always looking for where's the biggest marginal benefit. Right? Where can you get the biggest return on your efforts? And I always kind of realized at the beginning, okay, I can see that the gut tube and the integrity of the gut tube seems to have a big impact, but I can see that it's a little bit more beyond that from our ongoing conversations. But you feel like there might be a few maybe tricks up our sleeve to be able to get us there quicker and maximize marginal benefit?
Yeah, remember that, again, you just said it. I want to remind everybody that 70% of our immune system is clustered around our gut. Think about that. 70% of our immune system is around our intestinal tract. Now, why is that? Is that because whoever designed the body didn't have a better place to put it, so cosmetically they just stuck it on the immune system, on the gut? No, it's not. Because in the course of living, an average person will eat between 10 and 20 tons of food that are foreign molecules. They're not the same as you. They're from foods that are not you. And therefore, your body has to make a decision, what are friend or what are foe? And the way it does that is by having this very adept communication tool called the immune system that sits interfaced between you and your food. And that's all around your gut. So if you start asking then, what have we learned through these blue zone areas of the world? And I had a remarkable opportunity to be kind of introduced to this when I was up in the northern reaches of China 2 years ago, the largest city in northern China. And I was traveling on the bullet train all the way 2,200 miles to Shanghai across central China at 250 miles an hour silently, which was amazing in itself. And as the country of China went by, and I was with my friend who's a Shanghaiese gentleman, we were talking about China. We were speaking in English. I don't speak much Mandarin, and he was describing what's going on in the country, and I was asking about this interesting northern provinces of China, and I had been doing quite a bit of reading about these blue zones, and I had come on to this interesting food that had been a major source of nutrition for some of these ancient cultures, actually for over 2,500 years, called Himalayan Tartary buckwheat. And so I asked him, I said, this, as I'm reading some of this old literature, even going back into the Yellow Emperor's Handbook of Chinese medicine way back when, this concept of this Himalayan Tartary buckwheat comes up, and I just wondered, do you know anything about it? And it was so fascinating because it was like the train stopped. It didn't, but it seemed like it. It just like suspended. And I looked at him, and he just was looking at me, was not speaking. He had this frozen look on his face, and he goes, "You know about Himalayan Tartary buckwheat?" And I said, "Well, I'm just studying it. I don't really, that's why I asked you the question." He says, "This is unbelievable. You're the first person from America that ever had asked me anything about this. And this is a major area that we've been studying, my group and my company and the people I work with. And we're trying to find any American that has an interest in Himalayan Tartary buckwheat." Well, I said, "Well, you found him. He's sitting right next to you." So that started a really deep kind of friendship that ultimately got me to the United States to ask the question, who was growing Himalayan Tartary buckwheat in the United States? And when I did some research, I found out in colonial America that Himalayan Tartary buckwheat was actually a major food crop because it was so hardy. It was so vigorous. It didn't require fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides. It was able to grow in bad soil under harsh conditions and early and late winters and late springs and long winters. And so I thought, wow, I wonder what happened to Himalayan Tartary buckwheat. Why did it go away? Well, it turns out the reason it went away is that it has, because of its unique vigor, and it has a very highly active immune system. I don't know if people know this, but plants have their own immune systems. And the immune system of plants, because they don't have all the organs in their body like we have, as humans do, it occurs through a different set of principles which have to do with the production of these plant protective immune active phytochemicals that are locked into the genes of different plants. So you have a whole range of things that plants produce to keep insects from eating them, to keep mold from growing on them, to make them drought resistant, to get away from toxic soils and detoxify. Those are the plant's immune system. And it turns out that plants that have been growing for millennia in very challenging conditions have had to have very resistant genes to be able to survive. So they selected for these characteristics. And so they have very high levels of these plant protective immune active phytochemicals, of which obviously Himalayan Tartary buckwheat is right at the head of the pack. And in fact, if you took common buckwheat, which people are probably familiar with, and Himalayan Tartary buckwheat, which they share names, but they're very different in their genealogy, the amount of phytochemicals in Tartary buckwheat per the same amount as you would find in common buckwheat is more than 100-fold higher. 100-fold. Not twice as much, 100-fold as much. Now, what does that mean about the use of Tartary buckwheat in American agriculture? If you think about these particular phytochemicals, what do you know about them? Well, these are flavonoids and polyphenols. Unfortunately, all those things have taste. And for the American consumer who loves salt, sweet, and fat, those tastes are not good. They're bitter. And so over time, Tartary buckwheat, because it had this very bitter taste, got replaced by the very mild flavor of wheat and corn and sorghum and rye. And therefore, it got lost as an American crop, such that when I went back to the United States after my China trip and tried to find growers of Tartary buckwheat, I could only find one grower who happened to be a former Cornell University professor of agriculture in upstate New York. So I formed a relationship with him, and lo and behold, off we went. I said, we need to regenerate the agriculture of Tartary buckwheat in the United States because it is a regenerative agriculture crop. It's soil restorative. It doesn't require chemicals. It has a very powerful, unique nutritional profile, not just from the phytochemicals, but it has a very good probiotic form of starch. It has low glycemic index. I mean, all these variables that make it a really good food product, and it needs to be brought back in. And we can make this a product on family farms such that they can profitably grow it, not be mega farms. So here became cause celeb. At 74 years of age, I decided to start being an owner of a Tartary buckwheat farm. So now organizing cooperative growing operation, expanding our acres. My dream is in 4 we'll have 10,000 acres of Tartary buckwheat being grown in the United States, and we will make this an organic, renewable, self-sustaining crop to make family farm profitable and enrich people's health through the unique nutritional qualities of this product. That, by the way, the argument is these nutrients are involved with immunoregeneration, and that's our research that we've been doing. So now we have closed a circle: regenerative agriculture, sustainability, family farm restoration, healthy planet, healthy plants, healthy people, and making something that will regenerate immunity.
Amazing. Well, look, I'm all in. I'm super excited to support. I'm taking my buckwheat. I got my bottles through just this week. I got 2 bottles. My wife's taking it too. So we're on the big bold health train over here. And yeah, I just want to say, look, this even for me, you know, having spent this time with you over the last 2 years, specifically talking about this concept, it's specifically just come full circle in my mind now, and I get it, like, and I'm ready. And, you know, on your end, I can see that it makes a lot of sense to facilitate that closed loop. And for me, my sort of unique delivery system is to get groups of people together to make themselves hard to kill by regenerating their immune system through lifestyle and behavior change, because I know that group methodology is the way to facilitate it. And so I think that there will be many other people that will find their own unique ways to do it. But I think there are more and more people becoming aligned to the need for it. And I think that COVID in that way has been kind of a blessing. And never before has it been more clear that this precision public health is the future. And never has it been more clear that, that there's a lot of people coming around to it, and that this is a future that we can see happening. So thank you for your leadership, advocacy, friendship, support. And I'm excited to see the next 5 years. I think will be very interesting for this transformation and understanding of the immune system. And what I've been saying recently on my emails is that it's time to build the future. And I feel like a lot of people are realizing that, yes, it is time to build the future. We have the right building blocks in place, and different people are going to build it in different ways.
Yeah, I think, James, you really have beautifully said it. I so am admire your advocacy, admire your clarity of thinking, and your communication eloquence. I think it really is very, very precise about where we need to go. Let me just put one other thought that I think plays off what you just said. Our economy has been built out of the misfortune of many. It's a disease-focused culture. And a disease-focused culture, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that we don't need good disease care. We do. But if the centrism of our culture is around treating people who have had misfortune in their life, then we don't have the opportunity to expand our wings and grow into the opportunities that are fully available to people when they're healthy. And therefore, we need to have a health up and out culture balanced against the down and in disease culture. And it's not that one is right and the other is wrong. We need them both kind of working hand in hand. But the real missing ingredient right now is the up and out of a health culture that breeds enthusiasm, breeds optimism, and breeds the potential for posterity being better than that of its past. That is what you and I are both working very hard to try to achieve. And the more we can infect people with that idea, to demonstrate in their self-efficacy that they are in control and they will create this new reality, the more that we have made a contribution to a world that is going to be more stable, less traumatic, and less rooted in injury and more in recovery. Beautiful.
Well, Doc, thank you so much for being part of the Rogue Health Economist podcast. It's a great way to end this episode 11. We'll be back later this week with some other great conversations. I think I might have to do my own episode tomorrow just to unpack everything what just happened in the last 2 days. But yeah, check out bigboldhealth.com if you're interested in Himalayan Tartary buckwheat. And I'll put up other details. If you are interested in joining the functional medicine revolution, We have a pivot guide that can make it easy for you to build a low overhead functional medicine practice. And if you're interested in joining groups of people together to build your immune resilience and become hard to kill, we'll have more details on that coming up soon. So Doc, thanks so much for being with us. It's been a great hour. Appreciate our time together, and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks, James. Be well.